If you or a loved one are neurodivergent, I think you are going to absolutely love this show. I think you're going to find the theory of overexcitability as fascinating as I did when I first stumbled across it. So, in this episode with Chris Wells, neurodivergent writer, social worker, and Dąbrowski scholar, we dive deep into overexcitabilities, how they map so beautifully and cleverly with different types of neurodivergence, what this all means, and how perhaps it actually supports those of us on a path of inner transformation and individuation. It is such an exciting topic, which is kind of a pun, but also true. And again, I think you're going to find it quite mind blowing because it goes into places that I just haven't heard spoken about in this way, despite having spent a lot of time studying everything known about neurodivergence. Let's dive in. Hello, Chris. A huge warm welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. I'm excited to be here.
Well, that's a pun already, isn't it? So, talking of excited, I am really, really looking forward to this conversation. And first, would just love to know, how did you come to this body of work of overexcitability, positive disintegration? Like, it's the concepts akin to much of our own work using different words, but I know the very first time I heard you talking about these things, I was like, oh, this is a whole other lens, and it feels like there's gold that lies there. But again, it wasn't something, despite all the research and work that I've done in similar areas, it wasn't something I'd come across before. So I'd love to know what brought you to this work.
Sure. Well, I discovered it when I was in this deep process of trying to figure out my own past. That's what initially brought me to it. And it came about because of some traumas that I was going through in my life, more than one. The first was related to my son. He really had a tough time in early elementary school. We ended up pulling him out and homeschooling him. And I discovered the term twice exceptional, which means, intellectually gifted and disabled with at least one other disability. And when I discovered that term, not only did I understand him better, but myself, because I had been identified as a gifted kid when I was young, but I had so many struggles when I was in early adulthood, especially, that I ended up seeing myself as mentally ill and really leaning into being disabled, and forgot that giftedness had been something that that had been seen in me, at least, even if I didn't see it myself when I was young. So at that time, when we were going through this with our son, that was part of it. But the other part was a trauma in my family where I learned that a close cousin was like gravely ill from alcohol and, was going to die. And seeing that happen to her really made me wonder. We were only a year apart in age, and I just really thought to myself, why am I the one who survived? Like, why am I the one who's thriving in my life now? How did this come to be? And I was a doctoral student in psychology at the time, so it was kind of a perfect storm for me to really explore the literature on giftedness. And that's where I discovered Dąbrowski's theory. I just happened to be doing searches trying to understand myself. So I was looking up like giftedness and emotional intensity, giftedness and mood disorders, giftedness and, whatever else I saw in myself. Mental illness, honestly, was the phrase that I was using with myself at the time. And this was 10 years ago, almost exactly. And so I found this chapter by Michael Piechowski, and I've talked about it on our podcast, and I saw myself in what he was saying about the overexcitabilities and positive disintegration, but I didn't resonate with it at first. I I came to it and thought, well, this is a really euphemistic way to see this. Like, I didn't understand that there was this deep theory behind what he was saying about overexcitabilities. At first, I had a resistance to it because I just knew. It's so funny to look back on these things and realize that I just knew that if I embraced this idea of positive disintegration, overexcitability, it was going to cause me to rethink everything that I knew about myself, and I didn't want to. I had accepted myself as mentally ill. I was at a point where I wanted to come out against stigma with mental illness and say that you could still have a good life and be mentally ill. I wasn't ready to reframe this understanding I had as something else, something more positive. I was okay with the DSM at that time. I wasn't trying to rethink mainstream psychiatry or mental health. And but yeah, that's exactly what happened.
And do you mean consciously or subconsciously? Like looking back, you can see subconsciously you just knew that it would completely change everything you knew.
That's right. Right. It wasn't conscious for sure, but
Yeah.
it became more conscious and in my awareness, and it was something that I, like, maybe a year later or even 2 years later, was consciously grappling with. But yeah, that was the first resistance I felt, was just knowing that this was a different way of looking at things. And I was okay with the pathology paradigm at that point, I would say, or the medical model, however you want to phrase it. I wasn't looking for an alternative.
Yes, that really makes sense. It is one of those things, isn't it? When we look back and we're like, oh, bless my heart, it everything I'd created around me and the meaning I'd made of it was working. And it's like you really are wanting to kind of like hold on to that, because it makes sense. It's got you where you were, and yet there is somewhere beyond that. So I'd love to know if you're willing to share what you were then experiencing and naming as mental illness, and how will you describe that emotional, what was the word you used, that with the
Oh,
kind of
emotional
searches that,
intensity.
yes, emotional intensity, how was that specifically showing up for you, and what were the names that you were giving to it at that time?
Well, at that time, 10 years ago, I had really settled into bipolar disorder as a diagnosis that I'd had for more than 20 years at that point. Is that right? Yes, slightly more than 20. And so also panic disorder is something else that I had internalized. There are other diagnoses I'd had as well. And so I, in my 20s, had spent quite a long time on disability for mental illness. I was hospitalized for the first time when I was 21 after 2 suicide attempts the month before. And once I'd been hospitalized for the first time, it really opened the door for me to, see myself as broken. That to me was such a perceived failure for me. Like that, it felt like really the end. And I felt lost for a really long time. I was hospitalized many times in my 20s. I was on many different medications, saw a lot of different clinicians, had many diagnoses. But, over time, in my 30s, I was better. By the time I discovered Dąbrowski's theory, it had already been years since I had what I would, label as a depressive or a manic episode. And so I just saw myself as well managed on medication. I wasn't rethinking that diagnosis at all. And it was still, let's see, it was a year after I discovered the theory that I did start to question whether I had bipolar disorder. I also was diagnosed with ADHD in adulthood, and taking medication for ADHD was the thing that made the most beneficial impact from a medication perspective. And so once I started taking stimulant medication for ADHD, I thought, oh wow, I am able to function. Maybe this is what it is. And my clinician at the time agreed that I seemed more like an ADHDer at that point than someone with a bipolar disorder. And so I went through kind of a process with the woman I was seeing at the time for medication of rethinking maybe this is more me. And so I stopped taking medication for bipolar disorder, and kept taking medication for ADHD. But eventually I stopped taking all medication. And now it's been almost 7 years since that point.
Goodness, yeah, I can really understand why for you there was this. Yeah, I've got myself to the best place I've been. Why would I want to risk this? um, so I'm interested. What was it? And I appreciate there wasn't an initial kind of like, wow, this is amazing. It was quite the opposite. But the point where you did start to feel there's something here. What was it that was speaking to you? Because as we were talking about before we started recording, for me, understanding, I guess, firstly, that I am neurodivergent, but also, I guess, and this is really a continuing exploration, like what that actually really means beyond our kind of modern conception of it, what it really means. That for me has provided, I guess, a portal to Dąbrowski's work has provided to you. But what I'm interested in hearing, but that's been a real kind of the answers aren't evident, they're not the way that we typically speak about neurodivergence. So I'm really interested, what was it in that body of work that allowed you to start to think, this is something different. There's something being spoken about here that opens up doorways that haven't appeared to be open before?
I think it was the more I learned about the theory behind the over-excitabilities. I think if I had just discovered the over-excitabilities and stuck with them, it wouldn't have been enough. It wouldn't have led to everything I've gone through. It was really diving into the theory and trying to understand it. But I would say also the relationship that I developed with Michael Piechowski, who it was his chapter that I discovered in 2014. And so 2 years after I discovered the chapter, I was in contact with Michael. And as I got to know him better and was studying the theory, it was those things together because, also like diving into Dąbrowski and what he said, really trying to tie together that early work that Dąbrowski did in the 1930s, especially with our modern understanding of neurodivergence. It was a years-long process of trying to understand the theory and the processes that Dąbrowski was describing and understand, well, what was he talking about with these 5 over-excitabilities? Well, he was talking about various kinds of neurodivergence, not only giftedness, not only autism or ADHD, but all of these things and more. The more I learned, the deeper I went down the rabbit hole, really, and including like learning Polish, because I realized that there was this body of Polish work that had been unexplored by English-speaking people. And so the more I dug into the Polish work, the more I saw the connections with neurodivergence, because he was talking in the 1930s about children that we would now give a variety of diagnoses to.
Yeah, I love you learning Polish. It's just like, oh my goodness, yeah, I can really feel like when I'm passionate about something, I'll do anything to get to where I need to go with it. Really relate to that. So I especially, even though, as you say, it was kind of before, you could say almost like we've become more sophisticated in our understanding of neurodivergence and naming of them. But in some ways, I feel like there's a sort of limiting around the way that we do now conceptualize and name neurodivergence. I think there was something that more maybe like first principles in what he was describing there. So I guess firstly, I'd love to, if it's possible, to kind of give a bit of a synopsis of his theory and then understand a little bit about these over-excitabilities and how you would describe them, because I feel like there's something in that. I certainly know when I heard you first talking about them and then did a bit of research, I was like, oh, this feels as though it's talking about these things in a much less like constricted way. It's almost like just talking about them as they are, as opposed to needing to like put them into groups with labels. But I'd love to, if it's possible. So, firstly, understand, synopsis of the theory, and then a bit more about the over-excitabilities.
Sure. Well, to understand the theory and where it came from, you have to think about the fact that Dąbrowski was born in 1902 in Poland, and he became a psychiatrist and a psychologist, but also he experienced these overexcitabilities. And he, growing up in Poland during that time, World War II happening while he's an adolescent, he experienced a lot of suffering in his early life. And he also lost a close friend to suicide at, I think, 16. And so this experience of early suffering, including his own experience of being neurodivergent, clearly, led him down this path of becoming a clinician and studying the very thing that he had been through and that he had observed people grappling with and dying from, right? And so he started with these constructs: nervousness, psychoneurosis. I mean, those are the terms that were used at the time. And nervousness, he used that word synonymously with overexcitability, and it predated him. Overexcitability is not a term that he coined. It actually appeared in William James's Principles of Psychology in 1890. And so, it's an old word, but nervousness was kind of this vague, functional disability where, people struggled and so now when I'm trying to explain it to people, I'm like, well, think of the terms we have now. Think of a child with ADHD, right? Think of an autistic child. Think about the way that they struggle in their environment, in school, how if you're a parent who has a kid who is neurodivergent, you struggle because in all of our systems, we are expecting children to be normal. I mean, whatever that is. But anyway, nervousness is just like this broad term that Dąbrowski differentiated into these 5 types of overexcitability. And so, again, he's not the only one who looked at it and kind of differentiated it, but he did it in a way that really provided the foundation for this theory. Because, in his early work on nervousness, he was using the term disaggregated and then disintegration. And so he saw that if you had these types of overexcitability, and I can name them, they're emotional, imaginational, intellectual, psychomotor, and sensual. Each one has a variety of manifestations, but I think it's interesting to note that the emotional type has the most manifestations. And he also
the most varied manifestations.
That's right. Yeah, like the most ways that it looks in us and that we experience it if we have it. And so you can have one type theoretically, or you can have all 5 types, any combination therein. And he saw that there were different levels of overexcitabilities, and that's harder to explain, but it goes to the positive disintegration part, because for Dąbrowski, he believed that if you had, say you had 4 or 5 strong overexcitabilities, you were more likely to experience positive disintegration. And so that process looks like a breakdown of your psychic structures. And that's exactly how I experienced it when I was 20 and 21 and having what I called in 1993 and 94 like a nervous breakdown. Well, yeah, exactly. Like I literally broke down, was experiencing disintegration through like dissociation. I didn't feel like I was real. I didn't know who I really was. I had to go through this whole process of defining who I was and creating who I was to move out of that. And so I realize that I'm kind of all over the place with this right now. But disintegration is what happens if you have these experiences of overexcitability, which is a real flip of the idea that if you have them, there's something wrong with you, that these are problems. I mean, he saw these positive developmental implications in experiences that other people were seeing as problems, as, like I said, functional disabilities, as, and to think again of Dąbrowski as being in Poland, living through both world wars, like the Nazis were exterminating mental patients. They were, I mean, in the whole eugenics movement, and you think about people being killed because of these things, he said, no, these people are sensitive. These people, we're pushing them to the side and marginalizing them, but they have the raw materials for personal growth within them. I mean, it's really an amazing reframe of what most people think of as a problem.
Wow. Yes. Yeah. It's like it's novel today. It's revolutionary today, let alone back then. So if I can say how I'm understanding you said, and then please do correct me if I'm off at any place on this. So he was theorizing that people with these different overexcitabilities, which could be, for example, like more sort of sensitive emotionally, let's say, or sensory, that already has a kind of like a way of manifesting, a way of being experienced, a way of exhibiting. And then there is a point in their life where that creates what we might describe in today's world as a breakdown, as a point where they're unable to function in the way that they have been functioning, in a way that's deemed acceptable, appropriate in this world. And the opportunity within that is to, I guess, know themselves, reclaim parts of themselves, have the sensitivity to even sort of sense what's really here, what's really there for them, what's really here in the world, to then ultimately, I guess, integrate. That I guess there is a kind of like, there is a positive to the disintegration, but there is also like a positive integration where what's being integrated is what's authentic, let's say, what's true. Is that, I've used different words in kind of like my own way of naming it. Is that right? Is that what's being said here, or am I missing something?
No, you're right. But what's missing is just that he called them dynamisms. He believed that there were these forces for personal growth that could shape us, that really are the products of the overexcitabilities, which are the raw materials that can create them. And so, for instance, and so there's also two developmental processes that he saw, and he used the terms unilevel and multilevel. And so a unilevel process is lacking a hierarchy, because for Dąbrowski, he believed that transformative growth, the inner transformation was a multi-level phenomenon, that it came from a vertical shift, so that's the multi-level process. So the unilevel process, it's less conscious. It can present more somatically as ailments that people don't realize comes from their psychic suffering, or their psychological suffering. I know that I personally went through that too in my life, where, I had an ulcer when I was young, or I had other issues that were somatic. Migraines, is something I struggled with when I was younger. And so, but I didn't realize the connection between my anxiety and my physical state when I was young. Like, the more conscious my struggles and inner conflicts were, the more I was able to resolve them and grow from them rather than recycle them, right? And so the multi-level...
Oh, I love that. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So the multi...
could say, is it levels of consciousness that, when he's talking about levels, is that what the levels are?
It's very analogous to that, I would say. Yeah. I mean, he really outlined different types of development with it, using his own language. But yeah, there's very much overlap between the idea of levels of consciousness, for sure. And so the multi-level process is really the one that we would be talking about on your show, because it is the one where you are going through an integration process that is based on your values, that's deliberate, it's conscious. as I mentioned when we were chatting before we started recording, I listened to your show about, doing the inner work, that there is inner work that can be done, that there are guidelines around this. And while I was listening, I was thinking to myself, yes, like, so the higher multi-level dynamisms in this theory are the ones that are the integrating process where they are within your control. They're more conscious and deliberate, whereas the early multi-level process is more spontaneous. It happens to you and you are astonished with what's happening. You're maybe feeling some disquietude and wondering, like, what is going on? Like, what is wrong with me? Am I losing my mind? But these dynamisms, you can look to their source in strong experiences of emotional, imaginational, or intellectual over-excitabilities kind of combined and producing this really intense experience of reality.
I love that. I love that word, dynamisms. So, if I can give you an example from my own life, and if I'd love to know if this is what's being talked about here, or as an example of what's being talked about here. So much of what we're talking about is like I can map directly to my own experience. You're talking, I too had years of panic attacks. I had chronic facial pain for 15 years that was like a complete mystery to the medical profession. And so many different experiences of this kind that, again, at that point, I had no understanding of what was at play. I had no understanding there was a kind of deeper link to other aspects of myself. And then as I began to become more conscious, let's say, of these sort of like different parts of myself, I then had a period, I'd had actually this from teenagehood, but became this intensity of hypnopompic hallucinations, which were at the time becoming really disruptive to my life, and quite scary, to the point when I was having them so often and to such a degree of intensity, I was really fearing for my sanity. I was like actually starting to think, like, is this me going mad? And I now see, this is how many years on from that point, that I guess possibly that would fall into the kind of imaginal oversensitivity, over-excitability. But now in the work that I do, some of it which is like working shamanically, that kind of openness to, I guess, visions and symbols and I guess like other ways that we can perceive reality has been incredibly valuable to me personally, has shown me things about myself and to life that have been deeply, deeply healing and transformative, but also in the work that I do with other people. And so it was something that definitely was experienced in, a terrifying way at points, that became something that potentially is what you're describing as this dynamism. Is that kind of an example?
Yeah, I think that was a wonderful example. Yes, exactly. Yeah, I mean, I think so. Like what you're describing sounds to me like it produced disquietude for you and perhaps other dynamisms. I mean, the ones from the spontaneous multi-level disintegration, even the names of them you can tell are kind of emotionally charged. Dissatisfaction toward oneself, disquietude toward oneself, or dissatisfaction with oneself. And so shame, guilt, and so in the theory, like these are, he called them, they're shapers of development, that they can, like if you let the dynamisms guide and shape you, they can. But unfortunately, because they're painful, often I think people experience them and they want them to go away. They may opt into mainstream psychiatry and medication rather than realizing these are things that if I let them unfold can show me things about myself, show me a new way of living. Like when you were describing what you went through, I thought to myself, well, it sounds to me like you had glimpses of your personality ideal through them, which is something that I experienced too, where I had access to, because I have a strong imagination, of visions of myself and what I could be. But until I was able to stop thinking of myself as mentally ill and somewhat defective, I was really hesitant to embrace those images and to really believe in myself as somebody who could help myself heal, let alone other people. And so
Mm.
there's so much of a process I think you have to go through of trusting yourself. And but this is where this is the inner transformation that you're allowing to unfold, right? I mean, like the dynamisms of the organized type of positive disintegration, this is, they have, he used terms that aren't necessarily accessible to people, like third factor, inner psychic transformation, subject object in oneself. But if you start to, read about these things and see how they unfold in people's lives, then they make sense. The subject object process is really, being able to look at other people subjectively, to look at yourself objectively, to
Mm.
see like how you're impacting other people, how, like, to see a better way of being, really, I think, to let that unfold. Um, you know, Inner psychic transformation, he believed that people who don't have strong overexcitabilities have a weaker possibility for inner psychic transformation, but that people who do
Mm.
have these strong experiences of overexcitabilities are more likely to go through transformation. And so to me, I think, like, I always struggle with, well, we need more research, and we do. Like, we do need more research with Dąbrowski's terminology to see how it maps onto our modern psychology and, like the way that we understand these things now, like in the 21st century. There's a lot of work to be done there, but intuitively, it's really easy to see how it works in people's real lives.
Mm.
And other high level dynamisms in the theory include, like, responsibility, autonomy, authentism, and then the personality ideal. But it all makes sense when you think about higher levels, like you said, as, levels of consciousness. And the more you are focused on problems outside of yourself, trying to help other people in their development, I mean, you're naturally, like, I mean, if there's one thing I've learned just personally working with people, it's that the people who are suffering the most are the people who haven't figured out yet that they have to stop focusing on themselves and their problems and looking for blame, looking for, like, who is the cause of my suffering. Like, when you realize that you have to move outside of yourself and help other people, like, I think these things naturally unfold.
Mm. And it's a real, funny enough, I was having a conversation with one of the team earlier. We were talking about um, I guess, deeper we go in our own inner work, it feels as though there is this, like, 1 minute it's like, oh, I'm doing the work, for myself, which ultimately, that's what we've come here to do, as far as I'm concerned, like, to be in that, actualization, transformation of ourselves. And yet it's often done through that service to others, but it has to be both. It's like, as we serve others, we're discovering ourselves, which then we serve others. And it's like, whenever we think it's one way, we're missing the fact that ultimately this is a transformation of self. And so it's trying to have a foot in both places simultaneously. But of course we don't. We think, oh, it's all over there, and then we are kind of like so focused on other, we forget about, oh, this is ultimately in service of my own individuation, or whatever word you want to give to it. But yeah, it really is like this just sort of cycle that unfolds, and then we're kind of either conscious to it or not. So I'd love to, the time's flying by, but I'd love to, before we close, just speak a little bit more about the over-excitabilities, because I feel that, for people listening, there was something for me, certainly when I heard about them and then I did a bit of research myself. I was like, oh, these are so I read through them, and I think I probably have possibly all of them. I was like, yep, that sounds familiar. There was something in the way they were described, the languaging, that was just so accessible, so tangible, and really felt like this kind of fresh take on things in a way that I'd not heard them speaking about before. So I'd love to just spend a little time before we close talking about those, because I think they could be a real kind of window into this work for people listening.
Sure. Yeah, I agree that the language and so while you were just saying that, I was imagining the table of the forms and expressions of overexcitability, because there is this table that was compiled by Michael Piechowski. It first came out in 1979, but it was revised in his book in 2014. But yeah, where he gives the 5 types and the language that of the types of manifestations is all very positive for the most part. And, and even just what I had said a couple of minutes ago about, like, I think like there's so much self-compassion that came for me from learning about the overexcitabilities, and also compassion for the people in my life who, like, there's been so much of a resolution of the traumas that I've gone through personally, and when I think about the overexcitabilities, I was able to have a different way of understanding all of these things about myself that I had seen as problems. Like, that to me is the thing that flipped for me around it. Like, so take the psychomotor overexcitability, pacing, being very active. You tend to start to think of yourself as, well, I am too much, like I'm too fidgety. I talk too much, I talk too fast. Like, these are all things that I had labeled as problems. I saw them as ADHD related. And I mean, they are. Like, this is a connection. But the language around it, to see it just put in a way that is less pathologizing, really helps. And then, for the emotional one for me was probably, and imaginational. Like, the emotional one, I had thought that these aspects of myself were evidence of a mood disorder, but just the way that they're described, I'm trying to think now of like a better example, but even the somatic aspects, like having your heart drop or your stomach drop, or like a lump in your throat, the physical manifestations of how we experience things when we're upset emotionally, blushing, flushing, all of that stuff. But then also, strong relationships. I didn't understand, like, how come I can't forget about people the way that other people can? Like, I still have such clear images of teachers who were important to me, my friends when I was young, my first deep friendships with people, like all of these connections with places, with animals. Like, if you're a very deep person emotionally, I think that you see yourself in the emotional overexcitability and you feel seen in a way that you don't get from other descriptions of these experiences of being and that's not necessarily true, because there's big overlap with like Elaine Aron's highly sensitive person, and yet it's different. It's not a perfect overlap. And so I do think, like, I feel like I'm not capturing this articulately enough, but yes, like, I think that when you read these descriptions of the overexcitabilities, you access a new way of understanding things that often get pathologized.
Would you talk a little bit more about the imaginal one, or the one around imagination? Because I think, again, that's something that as a culture we have, for the most part, really undervalued, dismissed, and kind of like shut down quite early in, all children, let alone ones that kind of naturally have, more of it, let's say, or more access to
Right.
it. So I'd love to hear a bit more about how that might show up.
Sure. That one for me was one of the most important ones personally because I had had this extremely strong experience of imagination that caused me to have like an imaginal world that developed when I was a kid, which I always saw as something wrong with me. I never had, it's not really true. When I was a doctoral student, I discovered paracosm and other languaging world play that helped me see it through a more positive lens. But yeah, we don't appreciate imagination in children enough. And when I read the descriptions of like free play of the imagination, that having an imaginal world could be something that was a blessing instead of something that was wrong with me. It was a big deal.
Like lost
And
in
the
their own
same,
world. Yeah, and
yes,
like dreamer.
exactly. Right. Like all the negative connotations of that flipped as something positive. Well, if you have strong imaginational overexcitability, you're able to see potential and possibilities where other people can't. You can watch your personality ideal unfold in your own mind and see how you could and should be in ways that somebody can't if they don't have that kind of experience of reality. And so, like, reading Dąbrowski's writing around creating, imaginal worlds, dream worlds, really blew my mind because I thought, wow, here he's describing Kafka in a way where I'm like, yes, I have that too. Whereas it was just so interesting to me to suddenly see the blessings of this experience where I had just only seen it as a problem. It just was amazing. And the same for my kid who also had a strong imagination to be able to realize the positive implications of that as a parent. It freed me from so much worry and anxiety about him. It really transformed our lives because that helped me realize, oh wow, when I'm nervous about my child, it makes him nervous. Like to have that
Mm.
connection as a parent was so powerful.
Yeah, I love that so much. I was just recalling something that happened only a couple of weeks ago. That's what I find is like this journey, once we set foot on it, um, it continues to open up new discoveries. It's just like, round every corner there's like a new pot of gold. And only the other week I was doing improv classes with my husband, and we are talking about when, like when we're in a particular scene, I said to him, do you start to like visualize the things that are happening in the scene? Like if you're watching someone else, whether it's you in the scene or you're watching someone else do a scene, do you start to like fill in like the gaps, as in if they're in the kitchen, do you start to see the kitchen? And he's like, mm, maybe a little, but not really. Like if they're doing like if they're miming doing something, I might sort of be able to sort of imagine the thing they're doing, but not the whole scene. Whereas I'll be imagining, the sofa they're sitting on, the whole room, like, and sometimes it can be quite uncomfortable because it might be. There was one scene that we were doing where we were as if you were presenting a television show, but it seemed so real to me. I started almost getting like a stage fright experience, like a double. Like it's already quite scary doing improv, but it was like I'm doing improv on television. It was like an example where my imagination was conjuring up something so vivid and so real. It actually made it like even bigger the kind of task. And so it's so interesting. I think this is also part of it. Is when we don't understand that that's something that we are able to do. What I've certainly noticed personally, but also with clients and students, is sometimes what we're imagining is so vivid but also quite threatening. It's a scary reality, but we don't know that we're doing that. We don't understand that we've got this capacity to create, whole worlds, and they're not necessarily worlds that we want to inhabit. but even recognizing that we've got the ability, I think, starts to change something around our kind of agency about that, our understanding of like, oh, this is something I've created, is not something that necessarily is going to come true. There's something there that I think is really powerful in, understand the shape and size of what we're creating. I don't know if you've experienced something along those lines.
Yes. Oh my gosh. Yeah. Thank you so much for bringing that up. That was a perfect way to describe like the difference of having this strong experience of imaginational overexcitability. And yes, like I think that one of the most critical things personally for me was when I was 25, I did hypnotherapy and finally was taught actual skills for shaping my visualization and recognizing how much control I had over it, and that I didn't have to dwell in it, that I could say no and stop thinking about things that were disturbing. Before that time, it was so strong that it felt imposed on me and created a lot of suffering. And so realizing how much I could shape my own mental imagery was a huge part of my own process of personal growth, and still took many years to really kind of shape into where it was something that I felt served me well instead of, I think that it's really easy to live in our worlds that we create and to take comfort in them, even when they are kind of the source of suffering. And so, yeah, I agree. And I think that, again, it goes back to his unilevel, multi-level languaging, where the unilevel is when you don't realize you have the control and it is kind of imposed on you. And the multi-level is when you kind of can take control of it and shape it consciously, deliberately.
I'd like to touch on was it intellectual overexcitability was one of the ones. I'd love to touch on that before we close, because in theory, it sounds as though, that's something that we would prize and, just absolutely, there wouldn't even need to be a sort of naming of it, because everyone, so prizes intellect in our world. And yet I have a sense, and we touched on this briefly actually, I think an example of this when you said like learning Polish, in the ways that it can be shamed and seen as, like obsessive, this kind of like need to like learn like the details or the like, nth degree of something. But I'd love to hear a bit about kind of like how that's described and the ways that can show up.
Yeah, I think a lot of gifted children are kind of like the stereotype of intellectual overexcitability, like the endless why questions. Why? The curiosity that is so deep. And yeah, like just the avid reading, the drive to understand, like that search for truth and understanding, but also, it can become kind of pedantry, being pedantic. It can be something that is the source of shame for this population. It's not like intellectual overexcitability is not the same thing as intelligence, but it's common in the gifted. Dąbrowski thought it was the rarest type of overexcitability, which is interesting to me personally, because I think imaginational is, just based on the research that's been done. But interesting. Yeah, I mean, again, there's like more research needed before we really have answers on these things. But yeah, intellectual, having an inner dialogue, is something that I think people with strong overexcitabilities are more likely to have. And so I am always interested when I happen into a conversation on social media, say, where people realize that not everybody has an internal monologue or dialogue, and they're shocked to hear that. And I'm thinking, yeah, well, if you have strong overexcitabilities, you're likely to have this experience of, creating characters, creating, like the full-on experience of conversing with who knows how many people on how many ever tracks you have going in your mind at one time. It's a really intense experience of reality that this theory gives you a framework for understanding in a way that really celebrates you and this way of being, rather than making it a problem.
Mm. Yeah, that really makes sense. Oh, and this is probably an example actually of intellectual overexcitability. I was just like, yeah, and would still like to know one more thing. Um, am I right in thinking one of the ones we haven't touched on was sensory overexcitability? Yeah, and that one, again, I'll give my own sort of like sense of it, experience of it. But I'd love to hear that kind of your definition and your experience. Um, that's that what is one of ones I think that can be most challenging to experience. So, we're in a world that firstly is like quite bombarding from a sensory perspective for everyone, I think, but certainly if we have sensitivities in that way. And is also one that we can most be kind of shamed for and then internalize that shame. And for me, that has been one of the like most important like reclamations and acceptances, where now it was funny because when I read back for some, I don't really know why I was reading it back, but I was reading back on my autism diagnosis, like the report that the psychiatrist made. And it was so funny because it was my husband was being interviewed about me and giving examples of why, I might fit the criteria. And the examples he was giving, I was reading back and they were hilarious because I was reading them thinking there's a point in my life where I would have been like ashamed reading that, just would have been so cringing at some of the examples he'd given. Particularly, there was all sorts of examples, probably ticked all of the over-excitabilities actually. But one of the ones he was giving about my sensory sensitivities. He's like, if we go to a restaurant, everything will have to be just so. Like, so we'll have to sit somewhere where the lighting's right, and then we'll have to sit somewhere where it's not in direct, not near the air conditioner, where it's directly on her. And then, she might be talking about the smells in that particular place. And it was like he painted this scene for the psychiatrist and me just going in a restaurant, like everything having to be like just so and organized around me so that I could like be okay from a sensory perspective. And I read it back and I was just smiling, like that's exactly how it is, and it's okay, it's totally okay that that's how it is. So is that in alignment with the sensory overexcitability? And I'd love to hear your take on that too.
Sure. It's interesting because for sensual, he talked about it as like a heightened capacity for experiencing sensual pleasure. And yet,
Mm.
it is, I think, also the experience of sensory or sensual hell, too. And so this
Yes, it's
isn't
both, isn't
it really
it?
is. And
Yes.
so, sure, it can be that you are so moved by music that it brings you to tears or that you have the experience. Like, I remember seeing the Grand Canyon for the first time when I was 18 and feeling like my heart just drop and just this, you know, incredible experience. Like, so yes,
Mm.
like we can eat food and have a wonderful experience of sensual pleasure. But I, like you, am that person who needs, the smells to not be terrible, to, not be. I have, like, I always need to have headphones. This is not something I realized until I was in middle age, but oh my gosh, noise really impacts me. What if I had known that when I was younger? Like, I can't help but wonder, if I'd had this understanding of myself, how much I would have been able to accommodate myself and my sensory needs in ways that I didn't until I was in middle age. This is one of the blessings of being diagnosed eventually with a
Mm.
neurodivergence and in adulthood and figuring it out. But this framework can also help. And so yes, like I relate very much to those things, and I think that that is a big part of this. But this is a place where we need a connection in research because he talked about it as this heightened experience of sensual pleasure. We have like a gap to fill now as researchers in
Mm.
modern times to, help make sense of this from our modern understanding.
Mm. Oh, I love the fact that I'd forgotten it was sensual, and particularly about the pleasure part, because um, firstly, I think we often do experience it more, as you say, particularly again in this modern world where things just, are intense. The light's intense. Again, aircon can be really intense. Um, but there is absolutely, and this is something that I had realised for myself over the years. It's like, yeah, on the other end of the spectrum, I do have this like often like heightened um sense of pleasure, like those sensual experiences, like you say with food. For me, like visual beauty is a huge one. um all the time I'm looking at, it can be, as you described, seeing the Grand Canyon, it can be like overwhelming sometimes because it can be like so beautiful, or I'm looking at how I can make things more beautiful. Funny enough, we've just had our downstairs loo redecorated, and it's like Vincent van Gogh sort of Starry Starry Night, like an immersion experience, and it's just been finished. And the family came home, and I kept saying to them, "Go and have another look at it, go," because it's almost like I don't feel they're taking in the full level of beauty that they could be taking. And I was joking to my daughter, saying, "No, I just don't think the loo's feeling appreciated enough," because it was just like I don't think they're experiencing what I'm experiencing, which is this probably explains it. Because for me, I go in there and it just brings me alive. It's just like, so I can feel myself getting excited now, even remembering it, describing it to you. And it's such a great example where it's like, oh, they possibly just don't have that I have, and so they won't experience it in the same way as I do. But for me, it's so pleasurable just to look at something beautiful.
Yes. Oh my gosh. Yeah, that's so relatable. I feel that way so often where I'm like experiencing something that it must seem like so simple to somebody else, and yet, like, especially in nature, I've learned to I love flowers and
Oh my
plants,
goodness.
and I want to touch them, and I want to smell them, and I want to really appreciate them, and I just feel like the people around me are like, come on. Like, yeah, it's nice.
I'd be so with you there. It's hilarious because I'm exactly the same. It's one of my absolute favourite forms of beauty, and I love gardening. And I'm constantly saying to my family, "Have you? Oh my goodness, the peonies are blossoming! Look! Have you seen?" Yes, mummy.
Yes.
So, have we missed out any of the, sort of kind of like kind of bit of a meandering journey? But have we covered all of the over-excitabilities?
We did cover them all. And yeah, there's so much to all of them. If people are listening and want to know more, seek it out and read about them and the theory, and I guarantee that you will see yourself and be surprised with this different frame of your experience. It's cool to it's kind of like, it blows my mind to think about the fact that Dąbrowski lived so long ago and was making the connections he made at the time he was such a visionary, and just saw everything so differently from his contemporaries, but in such a beautiful way. And I hope someday that he is talked about in the same breath as people like Leo Connor, or, folks who are seen as important in the history of autism or ADHD, because Dąbrowski deserves to be talked about in the same breath as these other people, who were in some ways, think about like Asperger, more problematic, like we don't even want to talk
Yes.
about them anymore. And yet, he was doing his work, kind of toiling, unappreciated in his lifetime, but we're still talking about his work. It's still so relevant and non-pathologizing. And, it's like a frontier that still needs to be explored, in my opinion.
I completely agree. And yes, I'm really feeling your passion there as well. And, I sometimes have a similar thing about Jung, who clearly, as now, I think is starting to receive the acknowledgement that he warrants. But it's similar. It's like these people who have seen the truth of things and seen the truth in a way that is opening and something that leads to expansion. And versus, you say, they gave the example of Asperger's. It's just like, my goodness, the two different worldviews and what they can offer us. I completely agree. I love what you're doing and how you're really wanting to further his work and express it in a way that people can make use of it. So that brings me nicely to, where can people find out more about you and your work?
Oh, well, thank you. So I have a podcast that I co-host with Emma Nicholson called Positive Disintegration, which you can find on all podcast platforms, but it's hosted on Substack, and that's at www.positivedisintegration.org. And we share written pieces on there too, so it's not only the podcast. And then the Dąbrowski Center is a nonprofit organization that I helped create a couple years ago, and our work is to to further the theory of positive disintegration through advocacy, innovation, and education. And we're doing the best we can. And the only other thing, this summer, we have the 2024 Dąbrowski Congress in July, and it's going to be available virtually and in person in Denver, Colorado. And so, yeah, I'd recommend that people check it out virtually. We're going to have a really interesting lineup of speakers that I think your audience would connect with.
Oh, wonderful. Well, I very much encourage listeners to go and find more. And it was actually your podcast that I have no idea what took me, these sort of like funny paths that you sort of track and then end up listening to something. And it was listening to you on your own show talking about these things that sort of led us to this moment here. So I recommend listeners do go and check out your podcast and your other work. But thank you so much. It's such an enjoyable conversation, really has been. And thank you so much for being willing to sort of share your own examples too. I think, again, really brings it to life when we can hear those kind of theories and examples of them. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It was wonderful to have this conversation with you, and I would love to have you join us on Positive Disintegration because I just know that your story would resonate with our listeners very much.
Oh, I would absolutely love to. Thank you. I very much hope you enjoyed watching that. And if you did and you're not already subscribed, then do hit that bell thingy and subscribe to automatically get each fresh new episode as it's released each week. If you'd like to find out more about the work we do at Be Mythical to guide and support old souls in this new world to live their own unique myth, do hop along to bemythical.com and you'll find out all the ways you can join us and go deeper with us on your own mythical journey. Lots of love for now. Mwah. See you again next week.